Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining me on the Gift of Need podcast. I'm Jude DeMeglio-Trang. This podcast explores the often overlooked power of human need and how it shapes behavior, relationships, and society. And it's born from my belief that our needs are not burdens, but are gifts. My guest today, I'm so excited, is Sam Quinones, investigative journalist, author, speaker. He's the author of Dreamland, the true tale of America's opiate epidemic, and which was a National Book Critics Circle Award for nonfiction and one of the best books of the year in 2015. And also, The Least of Us, True Tales of America and Hope in the Time of Fentanyl and Meth, which was long listed for the Andrew Carnegie Medal. Sam, so you're gifted involved in so many things. I can't list them all, so maybe I'll let you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're currently up to.
Sure, Jude. Good to be with you. Thank you very much for the interest in my work. I've been a reporter for 38 years, several newspapers, including the LA Times for 10 years. I lived in Mexico for 10 years, was a freelance writer. A lot of my career I've been freelancing, which I'm doing again. Kind of fits my personality, perhaps, more than working for a major corporation. I started out as a crime reporter, kind of always have considered myself a crime reporter, and at the Stockton Record in Stockton, California. Moved to Mexico, as I said, for 10 years, wrote my first two books about Mexico, and then came back to work for the LA Times, and was during the time at the LA Times when the drug war in Mexico kicked off, and I was assigned to cover parts of that. Very crazy, vicious, sadistic thing that I never saw when I was living in Mexico. And along the way, I began to wonder why it was that we were seeing an enormous increase in heroin seizures at the border. The DEA was reporting this, and I was like, why? Normally that means there's more heroin use, but I couldn't understand why that was. And so I began to write about heroin traffickers and why they would, and along the way, I wrote about this village in Mexico that it was a major part of my Dreamland book that you mentioned. And along the way, I began to realize that they had a new market for heroin, that heroin was a drug that I thought we had left behind in the 1970s, but sure enough, more and more people were using it. And as time went on, I was writing about this town and their manner of selling heroin retail, black tar heroin retail in many parts of America. I began to realize that the major reason why they had this new market was because of this opioid revolution and pain management in American medicine that had taken over. And doctors prescribing, drug companies pushing very hard to get doctors to prescribe prescription narcotic painkillers. The most famous of which is OxyContin by Purdue Pharma. But I knew nothing about that because I had been living in Mexico when that was going on, when that began, and I really wasn't paying attention to much in the United States during those years. And so I began to realize, there was this transformation, man. Everybody starts prescribing that. That led to the Dreamland book. Those two ideas, that heroin from Mexico and was based on this new market that had been created of opioid addicted Americans by pharmaceutical companies pushing these pills and doctors prescribing them. And then that book came out in 2015. And within a year, within months, I began getting just enormous numbers of invitations to come speak, which I was not expecting. And it almost doubled every year for the next several years. And I just ended up doing like 265 speeches, I think, all across the country. Oh. In a 4.5-year period. It was remarkable, stunning to us in our family, and so that was. But then along the way, just to finish up the story, along the way, I began to realize that the story I had just written in Dreamland was itself changing, and it was now the opioid painkiller, prescription pain pills were being replaced by synthetic drugs out of Mexico, which itself was a revolution because most Mexican drug traffickers, when I was in Mexico, Mexican drug traffickers were basically farmers, ranchers, people tied to the land. And now here they were making synthetic drugs, meaning drugs with only chemicals involved, no plants. And that began to happen. And you saw it first, really, the first drug was really methamphetamine, but then fentanyl as the opioid thing took hold. And that became the basis of my second book, The Least of Us.
Yes, and I am really familiar, sadly, with the black tar heroin thing. We became acquainted after you released Dreamland in 2015. I sent you an email thanking you because it was a year after my son died from an accidental heroin overdose. And I had started writing a memoir taken from the journal that my husband John and I kept for the year following his death, which was called Opiate Nation. That was our true tale. There was so much silence at that time, in 2014, really, surrounding opioid addiction. Nobody talked about the kids at his school who had died from overdoses. Their funerals were kept private. And I was just so relieved when Dreamland came out to know that we weren't alone, that if our son wasn't unique, he wasn't a bad person. He was a young teen who seemingly out of the blue became a heroin addict. And your book was the first documentation of how this American nightmare really began. I'd like to talk about your latest book, The Least of Us, True Tales of America and Hope in the Time of Fentanyl and Meth. In it, you describe a new reality created by fentanyl and methamphetamine as a backdrop to tell tales of many Americans' quiet strengths to reclaim their communities through simple acts of helping the vulnerable. It's a need we all have, community. And I'd like to focus on that part today. Why are communities so important?
Well, first of all, let me back up real quick. When I was writing Dreamland, I encountered exactly what you just described, which was a national silence, particularly among middle-class families. No one wanted to talk about it. They hid the cause of death. The people who had loved ones who were addicted or died of overdose never wanted to talk about it. They hid it. And this was what I was dealing with as a reporter when I was writing Dreamland. It was nationwide. It was every part of the country. I could not find families. It was very difficult to find families who wanted to talk about it.
Yep. And
that ended then when I watched it end as as Dreamland came out, and more people like yourselves took the courage understood that they were not alone, understood this was not rare, that this was nationwide, in fact, and that allowed for all kinds of changes to take place in terms of budget priorities, awareness, et cetera, all these kinds of things, lawsuits against drug companies. When I turned my book in, Dreamland in, there was 3 lawsuits against drug companies. And then within a year or two, it was hundreds, and after a while, it was 3,000. So it was a remarkable transformation brought on largely by people like yourselves, coming out of the shadows into the light, telling their stories in various different ways, books or at church or on Facebook or in, wherever. And it really was a remarkable thing to watch. And I lived it. I had lived it pre-publication of Dreamland. I was like wandering around America and trying to figure out why no one wanted to talk about this because it was everywhere. And then after that, after the book came out, it was just remarkable to watch. And that's why so many speaking engagements, so many speaking invitations came my way, is because people were now like, oh, we need to talk about, we need to let's educate people. So it was a really remarkable thing. I would say during the Dreamland book, I began to realize the community aspect to this story, which is not just in the fentanyl and meth part, it's really in the whole story of opioid addiction and of, OxyContin and heroin as well. And I think we have always, as human beings, we have always, community is a desirable thing, but, and that means, a kind of a connection to people around you that is daily or semi daily, and just, neighborhoods and houses of worship and businesses and all that, that really brings people together. It is a desirable, but it's also absolutely necessary, because we would not, one of the things that has allowed human beings to become the dominant mammal on the face of the earth is precisely that need for community, it seems to me. And so that is really, and what I think happened in the United States is that we shredded that. We turned our back on that. We're so prosperous, we figured we didn't need it anymore. And that's I don't want to hang out with those people. They don't vote like I do. They don't have the same perspective. I don't like them. Whatever, all kinds of reasons. And we kind of retreated indoors, away from the public spaces, to our great detriment. Isolated ourselves. Remarkably, I think, and I think urban planning had something to do with this too. It's not just a choice. Frequently, you just don't have the forum through which to meet other people, and it becomes very difficult. And then people begin awkward, and then Anyway, to me, this felt like part of the story that opiate addiction, opioids, fentanyl, heroin, whatever, thrive in communities where isolation is common. And I think this was pretty much kind of part of the country. It was very hard to find places where this was not a problem, and where people didn't spend a lot of time outside. I frequently, when I speak, would talk about how I grew up in Southern California. We were outside from after school until, well, my mother was from Iowa. She brought with her to Southern California a farm belt, and every afternoon at 6 or so, 6:30 roughly, she'd walk out to the curb and ring the farm bell because her boys, she didn't know where her boys were, but one place they weren't going to be was inside the house on a Southern California.
Exactly.
Right. So, and you go back to that same block where I've been many a time, and since moving back to Southern California after Mexico. And there's nobody on that street. There's nobody at there's a beautiful, very significantly sized park with every amenity you would ever want for kids. Basketball, a little wading pool, playground, baseball fields. Nobody's ever there. It's absolutely empty. I don't even know why the city even maintains the thing anymore. Really, I mean, it just would seem to me crazy. I played football, basketball. I rode bikes there every single day, literally, when I was growing up, unless it was just pouring rain. So I think what we have built for ourselves is the perfect petri dish in which addiction problems can thrive. And that idea occurred to me in Dreamland. I kind of I wrote some about it. And then in The Least of Us, I would say half the book was about people faced with these horrible problems of fentanyl and methamphetamine, these scourges of synthetic drugs and just ghastly quantities and potency, that all of that, the way people, I wanted to focus on people rebuilding community, rebuilding, even if it was especially if it was in the smallest little way. It was not saving the world, it's just maybe a smallest little thing. But that to me is really such an important part of this story, and the way in which we should, I think, approach this very serious problem nationwide.
Well, sad to say, our family was part of that isolation thing. We moved from Birmingham, where my husband was a professor, back to the West because we wanted to be closer to family and stuff. And we bought a house in the wealthy area of town in the foothills in Arizona. We had 3 acres. We were not on a neighborhood street. we couldn't see anybody from our house. We were in a area, but it was not. And I remember John Life when he was young saying, "How come we can't live on a normal street where there's kids?" And we didn't. And how do you think that's the supply of illicit drugs from China and Mexico overlay onto this scenario of isolation on our whole culture?
No, I would say let me get to that in a minute, but I would say there's one
Okay.
other thing. Not only is it just isolation, we have also allowed to proliferate an economy of legally addictive crud too. And gambling apps would be the most prominent recent example of this. But of course, video games, pornography, social media. I mean, forget about it. You could go on and on. I think about the damaging effects on kids by social media. Hyperpotent marijuana now legalized. There's fast food, sugar. All these things are allowed to be sold almost without limit. And all of these things have a very damaging, addictive propensity that is now, of course, legal. And so on top of the isolation, you get this addictive economy that we have really, really not done anything to rein in. I mean, if you could watch the gambling app ads, I just think it's appalling what they're being allowed to say and promote. And ESPN's basically doesn't mention a game without mentioning the over-under and all that stuff, which I frankly don't even understand. But it's all about gambling,
Right.
gambling, and every sports guy who's made millions still thinks he needs to publicize these gambling apps. I think it's appalling. But all of that is also part of this story because we have allowed these to proliferate these products that are legal, that are addictive, and then made more so. I mean, the cup of coffee became the foot tall frappuccino with sugar, fat, and caffeine, all now and sold on every street corner, every downtown in America. So you have all of that. You have Facebook, you have a lot of different things. You could go on quite a long time, it seems to me, about the addictive nature of certain aspects of our economy. Pornography, as I mentioned, that kind of thing. And then on top of this, you get an enormous new supply trampolining on the market that was created by enormous supplies of opioid painkillers like OxyContin and Vicodin, and the whole idea that doctors now had to prescribe these things. And this was the way we cured, pain, eradicated pain, is with one pill for every person who was in pain. Every pain patient got the same pill, no matter what the background of that person was. And then so you create this enormous opioid addicted population of Americans. And then you have Mexican traffickers figuring out, first of all, they figuring out that the plant-based drugs that they once grew are actually not terribly profitable and more risky. And it's far better, in their view, to transition to synthetic drugs, meaning drugs made only with chemicals. Right. And so you get methamphetamine first, and methamphetamine, why is it better to make your own drugs instead of grow them? Because you don't need land, you don't need sunlight, you don't need irrigation, you don't need farmers. You reduce the supply chain of people dramatically, meaning less risk. There's no growing marijuana out in the big plantation where all the helicopters can see it. On and on. There's no seasons anymore. All that really matters now is not land. What it matters is connection to or access to shipping ports, control of shipping ports, because through shipping ports you get access to world chemical markets. You can get all the ingredients you would ever need, and that is really what began to happen in Mexico, little by little, but certainly by 2009-10 with methamphetamine. And then later, a few years later, With fentanyl, they began to realize we can make this stuff. They had already been making methamphetamine for about at least 15 years by then. And then all of a sudden comes along fentanyl. They discover fentanyl, which is a thing I write about. How they did that, I write about in the book, The Least of Us. And all of a sudden you get these supplies. This is the main transformation. You get supplies of both of these drugs that are just staggering, unbelievable quantity. Like methamphetamine, for example, is a perfect example because we know that we have pricing history for methamphetamine that's pretty much nationwide. Some areas never had any meth to speak of at all New England, for example. The Miami area, I understand, never really had it. Cocaine was but in other parts of the country, we have a lot of it. And what begins to happen is the Mexicans begin to make unrestricted quantities of methamphetamine. There is that the price, they cover the country gradually, beginning about 2008, 9, 10, 11. They gradually march across the country, and the methamphetamine reaches into New England. At the same time they cover the country, they drop, the price collapses. So it's an amazing idea that you would cover the country with one illegal substance and the price would collapse by 80 to 90%. Wherever I go, the price drop is 80 to 90% in when this new methamphetamine comes out of Mexico. What's more, the purity is unprecedented. It's no longer 60% meth when the meth cooks used to make it. It's now 95% meth, maybe 5% adulterant, right?
Wow.
And so you're getting all of this going at the same time. And then they figure out fentanyl. And fentanyl is like, oh my God, it's synthetic heroin. We don't have to grow poppies anymore. We could just make this stuff. And the supplies of both of these things really marketed together, sold more or less together nationwide, sometimes fentanyl put into methamphetamine, sometimes, and largely at the local level. I don't think those Mexicans were doing that so much until much later, but in fentanyl and the cocaine, there's so much fentanyl that they're putting it in different drugs to boost it, but then that addicts people. And so you get this enormous quantities of supply. And to me, that is the story. It's a supply-driven story, and it destroys people, and it destroys neighborhoods, and makes it and counties are just buckling under child protective services, county hospitals, jails, courts, on and on, coroner's offices, all that just buckle under the weight of all this.
Well, that's the well, I mean, we could go on with our story about it, but it was certainly, I wrote in Opiate Nation about how when I was growing up, and if you had a pain, you just lived with it. I never in my life took an aspirin. I mean, I had leg aches regularly. We never figured out what it was. We later realized it was weather related. And what my mom and dad would do was, after school, sit me down in the evening and rub my knees with witch hazel. I mean, that was it. Otherwise, you just, you had something done. You didn't have pain pills. And maybe some of those memories affected the fact of why, when our kids had things, I handed them a pill. Here, take a Tylenol. Here, take a Benadryl for your allergies. And that was, you thought you were being a good parent, right? But what that led to was having that mentality of a panacea for stuff, and that not really thinking how our character was developed. Part of it was by learning to live with pain, because pain is part of life on earth, and relieving it. There's so much about that yeah, we could go on forever. But
well, I think that's what the Mexican traffickers figured out. They knew about the pain pill epidemic in America when they developed fentanyl. Began to really make fentanyl instead of just buy it from China, which initially is what they were doing. That didn't last too long. They began to make it, and what they understood was that if we put fentanyl into look-alike counterfeit pills, that this will be a big market for us. We put them into things that look like a Percocet, look like a Xanax bar, look like a I don't know, a Vicodin or a oxycodone generic 30 milligram pill. If we do that, we will get all those people who are addicted to pills, but kind of the idea being that Americans just love their pills. We will get this new market, and we can control the dose to some degree, not very well always, but to some degree. And also pills kind of travel well, And so what happened was, beginning in about 2017 or so, you began to see that industry really explode in Mexico. It wasn't just making fentanyl, it was making fentanyl and then including fentanyl in pills that are designed to look like pharmaceutical pills that we sell legitimately in the United States. And all of that that just took over. It's a remarkable thing. I remember I interviewed the first American who was arrested for trafficking those kinds of pills from Mexico, Tijuana, into San Diego. And she was a woman addicted to heroin. She had moved to Tijuana to be closer to the drugs. They recruited her to cross, and they would pay her in drugs and stuff. I eventually interviewed her at some length. She's in prison, but from prison I interviewed her. And she told me that she would, on her person, on her body, hide kind of 1,000 pills at a time every time she tried to cross. 1,000 pills is a quaint number now. Routinely, border folks and DEA and what are taking down seizures of hundreds of thousands of pills at a time. I was just looking on Twitter about 20 minutes before I talk with you about the latest seizures out in Nogales, the border crossing. And you're talking 350,000, I think 350,000 pills. It's just staggering. But that means that all that's being made in Mexico. And that's how, excuse me, that's how the market has expanded, because they found that the pills were actually the best way to sell fentanyl to Americans. And that level of pills that you mentioned is really crucial in all that.
It's overwhelming,
Yeah.
When JL died of an overdose in the summer of 2014, he was using black tar heroin, and by that time was using it IV. And he had just come out of recovery. I'd been in a great recovery program at a sober living house, and we thought that all was well. But he'd had impacted wisdom teeth, and he needed them out years before, but we were dreading it because of the pain meds. And I wish we would have, I look back and think, what were we thinking? He could have endured that pain without those pain pills, but we let it go. And that oral surgeon prescribed him because he, was complaining about pain. He had Vicodin or Percocet 2 weeks before, 2 weeks after. I think he had like 100 of them, and that started his relapse, which of course then he had to go back. And when he died, we already had heard that fentanyl was in the black tar heroin. And so I asked for the autopsy for them to check, and they said no, but it was extremely potent black tar heroin that he had. Sam, we've run out of time for this episode, and I'd like to, can we do a second episode? And
Sure, no problem.
So we'll end this now, folks. And I want to thank Sam for the time to be with us and helping us talk about the needs that we have as humans for investigative journalism, for good books, for community, all of these things that are basic human needs. And in case you don't hear the second episode, check out Sam's work by going to samquinones.com. I can highly recommend his books, and thank you, Sam. We'll continue next time.